unleashing the power of onions, stepping up your garnish game, and the more the merrier, and more delicious. Restaurants have figured out key tips and tricks to make their soups more delicious than many home cooks could possibly dream. Here's a few of their secrets. If you want to make a soup that tastes amazing, you have to start building flavor right from the start, and in most cases, that begins with onions. Many soup recipes call for a single onion or maybe even two for a large pot. However, chefs are often heavy-handed with them. James DeBella, head chef of Lincoln Pin and The Cellar in Charlotte, North Carolina, admits, "I think we definitely use more onions in a restaurant environment than in a home kitchen." Chef Olivier Coster of Cast and Crew in Daytona Beach, Florida, remarks that it depends on the soup, but, quote, "Onions and garlic are an amazing base and are used a lot more in professional kitchens than at home."
Onions! Get your onions here, folks! God's own chosen vegetable. Nature's magic vegetables right here, folks!
Onions bring more depth of flavor to soup than you probably realize. Soups without onions or too few onions are often bland and lacking in flavor, although some recipes may use an alternative such as leeks. They also need to be sautéed before adding the other ingredients if you want them to taste their best. You might even want to caramelize them to add more flavor. Onions are what's known as an aromatic in the culinary world. This is the name given to vegetables, herbs, and spices used toward the start of cooking to create a flavorful base for a dish. But onions certainly aren't the only aromatics chefs use to make soups. As Chef James DeBella tells us, he almost always starts with a mirepoix, which is a mix of diced onions, celery, and carrots. He then adds garlic, black peppercorn, fresh thyme, and bay leaves. However, which aromatics DeBella uses depends on what soup he's making, saying, "If I am making a soup inspired by Thailand, I might use a base of aromatics using shallots, garlic, chiles, and lemongrass." Aromatics are fun to play with and will make a soup more fragrant, which also helps the stock taste deeper. Have you ever noticed your homemade soup lacking depth and brightness with no standout flavor? This is common when you try to use too many competing ingredients. At restaurants, chefs tend to focus on one or two standout ingredients and give them room to take center stage. As Chef Olivier Coster tells us, you want the main ingredients of the soups to shine. If tomatoes are in season, you would want to taste the tomato and not all of the other vegetables you added to the soup. Of course, you'll still want to use veggies as aromatics, then stick to just one main ingredient, such as pumpkin, spinach, or broccoli. The types of ingredients you choose are important. James DeBella gives this advice: try choosing vegetables that are not too overpowering in taste. The amount of protein you use in the soup should always outweigh the vegetables. Not all vegetables are welcome though. As Bernard Maringer, chef and owner of Los Angeles area restaurant Lustig says, "I would stay away from overly bitter vegetables or vegetables that have a bit of that dirty flavor. My favorites to use in soups are butternut squash, sunchoke, carrot, and kohlrabi." Creating the perfect balance of flavors isn't easy. Chefs are trained to do it, but the average home cook might not have the know-how.
I found that canned ham that we'd had forever, and I put it in a pot of boiling water, and guess what I'm calling it?
Soup?
Hot ham water.
However, it is something you can learn if you want to improve your homemade soup, and indeed any other dish. As Olivier Coster says, balance in a soup is probably the most important thing, and is what distinguishes a restaurant soup from a soup made at home. James DeBella told us about the importance of balancing the different elements of soup, adding, "Proper simmering is key here, as it allows flavors to meld together and mellow out, creating that balance." DeBella also believes a great way to create balance is to layer the flavors gradually, and texture can also play a part in balancing a dish, with DeBella saying, "If your soup base is creamy and luscious, you can create some wonderful contrast by adding something crunchy, like roasted nuts." Wondering why your favorite restaurant soup is so delicious? Well, it might be all the butter. Chef James DeBella agrees that butter is where it's at, admitting most chefs cook many of their ingredients in butter instead of vegetable or olive oil. Considering how much flavor butter imparts, it just makes sense. He adds that, quote, "A chef will always say fat equals flavor. So if you want your soups to taste more like restaurant soups, a healthy dose of butter might be the answer." That said, not all our experts use a lot of fat in their soups, with Olivier Coster saying, "I use only a little oil or butter in a soup. We get all our flavors from good ingredients and homemade stock." From that, we can conclude that butter is one way to add flavor to soups, but not the only way. Sometimes at a restaurant, it's not just the soup itself that's incredible, but the accompaniments that come with it.
You want bread?
Yes, please.
$3! What? No soup for you.
At home, you probably eat soup with a dinner roll or a hunk of crusty bread, but restaurants often elevate this pairing, with Bernard Merringer telling us, "There are so many little garnishes or side snacks that can be served with a soup that make all the difference." He tells us that his restaurant serves a sunchoke soup with a whipped ricotta truffle crostini, and his butternut squash soup is served with a pumpkin seed Gruyere grissini. He goes on to say that, quote, "The perfect accompaniment takes the soup into another direction and therefore adds layers of flavors and textures." While you might make 4 to 6 portions of soup in a batch, restaurants are feeding a crowd and making huge vats of it. You might think that soup tastes the same whether you make enough for 6 or 60, but according to some chefs, this might make a difference to the flavor. As Bernard Merringer tells us, "I think that the main difference between soups made at home and soups made in restaurants is the quantity that we make at the restaurant. There might not be any logical explanation for this. Logical or not, there could be some truth to it. With this in mind, you might want to whip up a big batch next time you make soup and freeze the leftovers. You probably won't want to cook up a restaurant-sized amount, but you could double or triple the usual quantity you'd make." Have you ever noticed that leftovers often taste better than the original dish did on the day you made it? It's not just the joy of being able to reheat rather than cook from scratch. Leftovers actually undergo chemical reactions that change and improve flavors, and this could be why soup at restaurants is so much tastier. As James DeBella admits, "I always try to prepare soups a day in advance versus the day it is served. The flavor compounds have time to meld together and create a harmonious flavor. For example, in beef stew, the carrots, potatoes, and onions can become sweeter and take on more flavor from the broth." He mentions that when you reheat soup, this breaks down proteins further and releases umami compounds, giving the soup a more savory flavor and rounded mouthfeel. According to DeBella, another reason he likes to make soup a day ahead is that exposure to oxygen helps reduce the bitterness in any ingredients that are high in sulfur. All this adds up to a tastier soup.
Good soup.
When your soup's not quite right and you can't figure out why, it could be because you're blending it when you should leave it chunky or vice versa. As Olivier Coster says, "For me personally, a blended soup is more of a summer vibe, and chunky soups are for the winter. And of course, the produce is important. Does it blend well? Do you get a smooth texture? If not, it might be better to make a chunky soup." James DeBella, on the other hand, tells us that he tends to stick with traditional techniques to guide him, saying, "Soups are generally classified into 4 main categories: thin, thick, cold, and national, though these categories cover multiple different types of soup. Thick soups cover purees, velouté, and cream soups. Thin soups can be further split into more categories, including clear, broth, bouillon, and chunky. Most people reach for boxed stock or bouillon powders when making soup at home, while many restaurants use stocks and broths made in-house. There's a big difference in flavor between homemade stock and the commercial kind, and it's bound to make a difference to the finished dish. As James DeBella reveals, "I always use homemade stock for soups at restaurants, as homemade stock will add a richer, deeper flavor and mouthfeel to soups.
We do carrot soup, butternut squash soup, sometimes broccoli soup. So it's like a nice foundation for whatever we're in the mood to cook."
And it's not just the flavor. There's more benefit to making your own stock, with DeBella adding, "Homemade stock is usually unsalted, and as homemade stock is fortified with more flavor, hopefully that means you will need less salt at the end of cooking." He notes that making stock from scratch lets you have more control over how much salt is added to the soup. You might be used to cooking with dried herbs and ground spices, but this is where chefs differ. They tend to add an extra punch of flavor by using whole spices and fresh herbs when making soup. As James DeBella informs us, fresh herbs can add freshness and flavor to soups, especially hearty herbs like rosemary and thyme, which are often used in longer simmering dishes. You can add a few sprigs of fresh herbs and remove the stems before serving. According to DeBella, other fresh herbs that work well in soups include parsley, cilantro, chives, basil, and mint. Basically, any herb works if it matches the flavor profile of the soup. DeBella also uses whole spices to create a subtle depth of flavor and adds them to a soup using a sachet bag, explaining, "A sachet bag is a small piece of cheesecloth that is stuffed with spices and fresh herbs, and then tied with a piece of twine to enclose the ingredients." If your soup isn't coming out as tasty as restaurant versions, it might not be your fault. It could just be that the equipment you have doesn't stand up to what professional chefs have in their kitchens, with James DeBella revealing, "Chefs also tend to have better equipment and potware to make and prepare soups. Your blender at home probably will not compare to a commercial blender, which will always be found in restaurant kitchens. That perfectly creamy consistency could be eluding you because your blender isn't up to scratch compared to a professional one. And if the flavors are lacking, maybe your pots and pans don't let you get the perfect char on your ingredients." There's not much you can do about this beyond enrolling in culinary school, but chefs have training, experience, and knowledge that us mere mortals just don't possess. The reason your homemade soup isn't as good as your restaurant favorite might just be that you lack the cooking skills of a professional chef. As Olivier Coster says, it's the tiny details we put in our soups, making the right flavor combinations and enhancing some flavors with spices, herbs, aromatics. We want you to remember that soup, and so we put a lot of thought and love into it, hopefully making that soup just a bit more special and tastier than at home. Chef James DeBella tells us something similar, that soups made in restaurants taste better because chefs have a refined cooking process, a practiced use of seasonings, and pay close attention to components home chefs might not even know about. As DeBella admits, chefs who work in restaurants also tend to season and salt every component of a dish at each step of the cooking process, building something at each step to create complex, layered flavor.